Okay, a few more people are coming in, but we'll get started in the meantime. So first of all, if you don't know who I am, I'm Eleanor Bassett. I'm the rangeland research ecologist with Range Branch in the Ministry of Forests in BC. And today I wanted to welcome you to our Home on the Range webinar series. The BC chapter has asked me to help host today. And a big thank you to the Kamloops Large Animal Veterinary Clinic for sponsoring this webinar series this fall. A quick plug that next week there'll be another webinar. It'll be Amanda Miller presenting, and that will be presenting on 3 years of targeted grazing to reduce wildfire risk. So what we'll do is I'll introduce our presenter. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes of presenting, and then we'll have questions at the end. In the meantime, you can always put your questions in the chat and we can get to them at the end, or you can unmute yourself at the end as well, and we can address questions that way. So Maddy is a newly hired supervisory rangeland research ecologist with the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center in Oregon. Prior to joining, she was a postdoc in Lauren Hallett's lab at the University of Oregon, where she collaborated with USDA ARS scientists at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center to study invasive annual grasses and rangeland resilience in the Northern Great Basin. For her PhD research at Yale University, she studied vegetation dynamics in African savannas and did field research in Kruger National Park, South Africa. Her research focuses on understanding how climate variability, disturbance, land use, all influence vegetation dynamics in order to inform effective land management and restoration. So with that, I'll hand it all over and I'll stop sharing for now.
All right, yeah, thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Great, so I'll go ahead and share my screen, and thanks for this opportunity to share my science with all of you, with an interested regional audience. So I will be talking today about drivers of annual grass invasion at local and regional scales. And as Eleanor said, I just started a new job with the USGS as of last week. But before that, I was a postdoc at the University of Oregon. And that's the work that I'll be talking about today, was that work done with Lauren Hallett at UO and Kirk Davies and Chad Boyd, who are at the ARS Research Station in Eastern Oregon. And I will be talking about one of the biggest problems that we face in the conservation and management of the sagebrush biome, which is invasive annual grasses, like this spread of cheatgrass in this picture. It's a widespread and increasing problem. So these are maps of estimated annual grass cover from 1988 on the left to 2018 on the right. And you can see how much these invasive grasses have increased over that time. And it's such a widespread problem that managers have to take a sort of strategic triage approach to it. If we consider invasive annual grasses being beyond eradication, which we do, no one is coming in and saying we're going to eliminate cheatgrass forever. What do we do about it? And so a lot of recent work on approaches to this problem have focused on distinguishing between different states, like a degraded state, a transition state, or an intact core state, with different strategies applied to each of those. So this figure is an example from a publication specifically addressing this in Idaho. It's also the focus of regional programs like sagebrush conservation design. And these are, by necessity, very geographically minded approaches that we have to know where these different states exist to be able to manage them accordingly. Making maps like this relies on knowledge of what determines which areas are most resistant and resilient to annual grass invasion. And a lot of previous research on existing patterns of annual grass invasion. Like we know that annual grasses thrive after fire or other intense disturbances at low to mid elevations, on warmer south and west facing slopes, and in a biotic environment with fewer perennial grasses and shrubs competing with them, especially the perennial grasses. But this is also not a static pattern that we're talking about here. You can see in these maps how much it's been changing over time, and there's still a lot we need to figure out about how and why these distributions are changing, and especially in the context of global change, how are annual grass distributions at local and regional scales determined by interactions between what's going on right there on the ground and how things are changing much more broadly. So for example, if temperatures are increasing, how much does that affect predictions everywhere? And how much does it affect predictions for a particular landscape with a particular topography? And so this is something we still need a lot of research about. There are also really important outstanding questions about how grazing interacts with these other factors at different scales. This is one of the most widespread land uses in this biome, that we have livestock, especially cattle grazing throughout the sagebrush. And there are a lot of questions about how grazing affects the vegetation in different contexts, before and after fire, in different environments. And this is also something that is happening at both very local scales, like within a landscape, there's variation in how much cows graze in one area or another. And then it varies across the region. And to some extent, that's up to managers in deciding where you get to put different numbers of cows at different times of years. And so this is something that we really want to understand to inform those practices. So I worked on this as a postdoc at the University of Oregon via a big observational field survey across Oregon and Idaho that I conducted in the summer of 2021 with this fantastic field team. So we called it the Northern Great Basin Survey. And we were assessing both regional and local predictors of vegetation. So some things like climate that vary across this whole region, as well as much more local factors like aspect, slope, grazing variation within a given landscape. And as I said, we're examining both existing grazing gradients and then how that interacts with environmental factors and across different scales. In total, in this work, we visited 45 different pastures. Those are the outlines in this map. These are all managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and pasture is sort of the smallest management unit within fence lines. And because fire is expected to be such a big factor in invasive annual grasses, we sampled about equal numbers of burned and unburned pastures. And then within each pasture, we sampled usually a total of 6 vegetation plots that were stratified by both aspect, so north and south facing slopes, as well as distance to water. So we would identify where the water source for the cattle was in that pasture, and then sample plots that were spaced at 500-meter intervals going away from those water sources. So 500, 1,000, and 1,500 meters away. For the analysis that I'll talk about today, I focused on a subset of that total survey, excluding sites where crested wheatgrass had been planted. So that's a species that's widely used for ecosystem rehabilitation in this system. We found that the sites planted with crested wheatgrass were quite different in terms of vegetation structure and how it related to the environment. And so to focus first on our primary questions, we've excluded the crested sites here, but that'll be the focus of future work, also comparing and contrasting sites with and without crested wheatgrass planting. So that leaves us with what I'm considering in this talk today was 29 total pastures. Again, about half of them were unburned, half were burned, and that contained a total of 173 vegetation plots. And what this looked like in the field is that when we arrived at a new site, we would first go and check that there was actual actually a water source where we expected there to be one, because the layout of all the plots was based on this. And so it could be a dugout pond looking like this, or a trough looking like this. And we collected data on what these water sources looked like in the field, what evidence there was that they were used. In some cases, by the time we got out there, say a pond would already be dry, but if there was evidence of heavy use based on trampling and grazing and dung right around it, showing that perhaps earlier in the season it had been used, then we would still count it and visit the plots based on that. The actual vegetation plots were done similar to the BLM AIM methodology, where we would have a plot center and transects going out like spokes from that center. And along each of these transects, we counted dung of cattle, horse, and other ungulates, and measured plant species composition using line point intercept, and also collected soil samples. So what we get out of this is, first we can look at overall regional patterns. So this is showing where all those pastures were that are included in this analysis. And you can see there's quite a bit of variability in the cover of different functional groups averaged within those pastures. And we'll focus today on 4 main functional groups. So annual grass cover, which we're concerned about, and 3 groups of perennials that can be part of the biotic resistance to those annual grasses: perennial grasses, resprouting shrubs, and non-resprouting shrubs. Resprouting shrubs are shrubs like rabbit brush that we know can resprout after fire. Non-resprouting shrubs are shrubs like sagebrush that don't resprout after fire. And so in trying to explain what's underlying these patterns that we find, I look at it at 2 different scales, sort of zoomed out and zoomed in. So zoomed out at this regional scale, what's driving this variation in vegetation as a function of fire, climate, soils, and grazing at that zoomed out pasture scale. And then we can zoom in to variation within pastures and look at that local scale, how does variation within a pasture in things that vary more locally, like slope, aspect, soils, grazing within a landscape, affect the variation at that scale. So looking first at that regional scale, a few of our major findings. One is that looking at fire, so we had about equal numbers of burned and unburned pastures. And when I say burned, that means burned anytime in the past 25 years. We find that fire promotes perennial grass. So there was more perennial grass cover after fire, and decreases non-resprouting shrub cover. So that's a lot less sagebrush in places that have burned, perhaps unsurprisingly. But actually there wasn't a very strong average effect on annual grass cover. You can see in this annual grass plot here with fractional cover in burned and unburned that the burned pastures contain both the highest and the lowest values for total annual grass cover. So yes, some previously burned pastures were really dominated by annual grasses, but also some of them had very little annual grass. And on average, unburned pastures did still have some annual grass in them, which means that the annual grass challenge is not limited to already burned areas. And I think this is something that people working on the landscape are increasingly recognizing, that annual grasses are increasingly everywhere. And so this is not something that we can only wait to address when a place has already burned. We also find that annual grasses decrease with elevation, and perennial grasses and resprouting shrubs increase with elevation. And this aligns with patterns that have been identified before in resistance and resilience ways of looking at this. So this is perhaps unsurprising that at the warmer, lower elevations, that's where we find the most annual grasses, and the perennial plants become more resilient as you get higher up in elevation. We also see a sort of similar pattern with respect to mean annual temperature across all these pastures, where the warmer it gets, the less perennial grass cover there is overall, and the more annual grass. But an interesting thing in this is that that annual grass response is mediated by grazing pressure. So what these different lines here correspond to is subsets of the data divided by whether there was more dung than average or less dung than average. So what we're using here as a metric of grazing is average dung counts. But we found that that correlated well with, for the subset of pastures where we had actual use data from land managers, there was a really good relationship between those dung counts and the actual use AUMs. And so that's why we're using it as an indicator here. So we see that in general, annual grasses increase as you get into a warmer place, but that increase is steeper in places where there's more grazing intensity, more cattle dung. Or conversely, another way of looking at that interaction that we found is to look at how annual grass cover responds to cattle dung, depending whether you're in a warm or a cool place. So we find the highest annual grass overall, this doesn't determine everything, including this outlier here, but in general, you tend to find the highest annual grass where there's a combination of higher temperatures and higher dung counts. Whereas there's actually a negative relationship with dung counts in cooler places, so more cows, less annual grass. And this is an observational study, and so I think a really important caveat here in translating this to management is that we're not sure, just based on this, what is the cause and effect here. It does suggest that perhaps this means that grazing could be helping to mitigate annual grass at cooler sites, but be accelerating it at warmer sites. And that could be a note of optimism in some places where we're thinking about where to strategically use grazing to control annual grass, but also a note of caution in places that are especially seeing increases in temperature. But we're not sure that that is how the cause and effect is working here. It could also reflect manager and livestock responses to existing vegetation, where perhaps managers are allowing higher grazing in places that are already warm and dominated by annual grasses, and hoping that the cows can help control that problem. So this is something where I would also welcome feedback and questions, trying to work through what do we make of this pattern, and what do we want to look at next to figure it out. So we also zoomed into looking within pastures, what explains that variability between plots within any pasture that we visited. And several patterns here. So one is that we were looking at distance to water as one way of measuring potential grazing intensity, where we expect that cows are spending the most time close to water and might be grazing the most there. And so here we see that perennial grasses, for example, increase with distance to water. So that could suggest some grazing impacts on perennial grass populations closer to water sources. However, we also looked at dung counts, and this is dung count variability within a pasture, as another way of getting at grazing and plant interactions. And also here we see that non-resprouting shrubs are decreasing farther from water at less favorable sites, which in the case of non-resprouting shrubs, that is entirely about fire. So these different lines here are showing that where you get that decrease, the light gray line, that's within pastures that are overall less favorable to non-resprouting shrubs. So that is pastures that have burned. That's the only place where you see that relationship. But coming back to making sense of the perennial grasses, the other way that we examined grazing at the within pasture scale was with dung counts at within plots, and the deviation from the pasture average. And there we see that perennial grasses increased with greater dung counts relative to the rest of the pasture. But specifically, this dark line means that's in places that in general are favorable to perennial grasses. So these would be in the context of the whole landscape, places that are at higher elevations, cooler, places where you have higher perennial grass productivity. You also find higher perennial grass cover in the places with the most dung, which contrasts with what you might expect based on the trend with distance to water. And so an important note here is that actually there was not a strong relationship between dung count and distance to water. And one thing that's going on here is that I think we started a little too far out from the water sources to really capture that hotspot effect around water sources that you can see where they're really heavily grazed. Because our plots, the closest ones were 500 meters, that's already sort of getting beyond where you see those really heavy impacts and out to a point where maybe other landscape factors start becoming more important. But what this means is that we can consider these as sort of two independent indicators of different aspects of grazing, where perhaps what this is telling us is that the distance to water is more of a long-term historical or cumulative impact of past grazing that you're still seeing in a sort of depleted perennial grass population closer to the water source. But that dung counts tell you more about what is happening here and now, and that this could reflect resource selection, where the cows are going to the places where there's a lot more perennial grass cover, and especially in the places where perennial grasses are really productive. We also see a response to heat load index, and this corresponds to that north versus south facing slope pattern, just turned into something continuous. So a higher heat load index tends to be a south or west facing slope where it receives more sun, more heat throughout the day. And with a higher heat load index, you tend to get more annual grass. So that's more annual grass on those south and west facing slopes and less perennial grass. And this is more dramatic for perennial grass in less favorable sites regionally. So that the lighter gray line is saying in sites that within the regional context are not as good for productivity of perennial grass, that's a much steeper relationship. So maybe greater difference between perennial grasses on north and south facing slopes in those landscapes. And this is important for thinking about climate change predictions and management, that there's this interaction between the overall temperature environment and then this local scale, where are you on the topography environment, where the effects of increasing temperatures are going to be reflected differently depending where you are in the landscape. So to summarize, key findings and new questions for this, we find that annual grasses are abundant in burned and unburned areas, which means we have to think about how to manage and restore proactively before fire happens. We see the most annual grass under a combination of higher temperatures and more grazing, but I think there's a lot more work to be done here figuring out cause and effect and what's the mechanism. And then within pastures, we find that perennial grasses are highest away from water sources, but also where there's the most dung, which could be a contrast between historical impacts and present day resource selection. And this perennial grass relationship to local heat loads, so perennial grass cover on north versus south facing slopes, also depends on where they sit in regional scale habitat favorability. So thanks to everyone who worked with me on this. That includes co-authors Kirk and Chad at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center and several co-authors at University of Oregon, Lauren, Lena, Joanna, and Cal. Thanks to this amazing field team who I got to work with for a season on this, and to the ARS for funding this work, and to colleagues at the BLM for helping with planning this massive field season. And thanks to all of you for listening to this. And I've included my new email address here if anyone wants to reach out afterwards.
All right, thanks very much for that. That's very interesting. There are a few questions in the chat that we can get to. And if people want to unmute themselves as well and ask a question, we'll start with Bob's question. Were you able to look at time since burn?
Yes, and actually that is the bonus slide. you've unlocked the bonus slide that I took this out in the interest of time, but this is a figure that I'm going to include in the paper here. So yes, we did look within the burned pastures. We looked at time since fire, and these are the patterns we see. Unfortunately, just based on where we were able to do this, we don't get a huge span of time since fire. So even though I said this could be a fire within the last 25 years, within these burned pastures, it just varies from 5 to 15 years. And you do see trends in resprouting shrubs and perennial grasses increasing over that time span. There was not a significant trend of annual grasses versus time since fire, which is not necessarily what I expected. But also, I think we're capturing a lot of variability here in terms of the annual grasses in the burned sites. And, I don't have data here about fire severity, about, what are they coming back from here. So, certainly there are some places that have really high annual grasses after fire, but not all of them did. And partly it's those other variables that we were considering that can explain some of that variability. But also, this is just really variable in terms of what a fire actually means in this landscape. And we're treating it as something binary here.
Is that ecological legacy difficult to tease apart if you have a system where the annual grasses are also creating a landscape where it's more prone to fire, so there's more chance of reburn?
Yeah, and that's something that I've also gotten a question about, talking about this previously, and I haven't looked into yet, is how many times these sites have burned. So not just time since the last fire, but if they have reburned multiple times, then that could also be affecting the patterns that we see. Yeah.
Okay, another question that's come up. Is there a problem? This question's from Bob again. Is there a problem using data from the year of observation, dung counts, and comparing it to the data reflective of longer term conditions in plant composition?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that we found with the dung counts, and this was just, what we could validate it against, was that for about 2/3 of the pastures in the study, I was also able to get actual use records from the range managers and relate those. And actually, let me just check if I have a slide about that relationship. Okay, no, I don't have that in here, but so to sort of validate what are dung counts actually telling us, I looked at the relationship between dung counts and actual use data. And it was a better relationship when I related it to the last 5 years of actual use data than to the year of sampling or the year before sampling. So because we were counting old and new dung all the same, dung patties can last a few years. And so really it's integrating over about 5 years of use and not just the year when we sampled. But I think you're right that it is still sort of more of a snapshot of grazing. And that's why we also included this distance to water metric, which is not perfect because I think there's a lot of landscape variability aside from distance to water that is determining, where the cows go. But if those water sources have been there for a long time, then that is probably going deeper in time than what the dung counts are telling us. Yeah.
In the future, would you, and maybe this just isn't an option, but in the future, would you consider using something like GPS collars on cattle to see where they go and how they use the landscape in relation to this information?
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. And I know that that's something that others have done in trying to understand these patterns, that it is a lot more complicated than just distance to water. You have cattle trails and roads and topography all affecting, and shade trees. We did observe some of that where you'd see a tree, it's just like, okay, they really like to hang out under this tree. All of that we know can be factors. And I think that could be really interesting to look at in some of these sites, especially in the sites where there was really not a strong gradient with respect to distance to water, to try to figure out what is the dominant factor in determining that variation in grazing intensity.
Nice. Any other questions? Oh, I got one from Cassia. Hi, Cassia.
Were all the pastures used every year?
Mm.
Some of them were on a 2-year rest rotation, so they've been rested every other year, but all of them had at least been used every other year in the past 5 years. So either every year or every other year. And that was part of that 5-year average calculation that we related to the dung counts. Did you see any trends or comparisons with respect to whether they'd been used every year? Actually, that isn't something I've looked at, and that's partly because we didn't have that data for all of the pastures. So we're sort of extrapolating from where we did have the more detailed data, related that to dung counts, and then use the dung counts as the sort of universal metric across the pastures because we had that everywhere. But I could pull out the subset where we know which years they were used, and see if there are patterns there. Yeah, it's a good question.
Anyone else, you can feel free to unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Cassia.
So maybe a bit of a offside question, but if you were to include things like soil burn severity in the future, what would you expect in terms of the annual plant or annual grass?
Yeah, so based on other work on this, I would expect that where burns have been more severe, then you're more likely to see a big increase in annual grasses after fire. And that's part of what's behind research now about, can grazing mitigate fire severity by removing some biomass before a fire comes through and making it a lower intensity fire, that if the fire is less likely to kill all the perennial plants, disturbs the soil surface less, that those are conditions where you're maybe more likely to see more of the existing perennial diversity persisting and not get totally taken over by annual grasses. So yeah, that would be my expectation, but not something that I was able to look at this scale, and so that would be really interesting.
Nice. Any other discussion points or questions so far? Are all the perennial grasses that you were looking at, are they all native species, or are some of them invasive?
No invasives. I mean, the biggest non-native one that we saw was crested wheatgrass, which is planted across the region, and those, as I said, were left out of this analysis, that we wanted to just focus on places where the perennial grasses were native. It did seem like we got sort of different dynamics in the places with a lot of crested wheatgrass, and that will probably be the second paper to come out of this, is looking at the pastures with a lot of crested wheatgrass. It did, and I haven't gotten into that as much. It did seem like there was lower annual grass cover overall where there was crested wheatgrass planted, which could be encouraging for where that's used, but we didn't fully get into pulling out what else was different about those pastures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just saw a question about that. Was the crested wheatgrass effective in suppressing cheatgrass? To some extent, yes, although there were also some crested sites that had a lot of cheatgrass. It was just crested wheatgrass and cheatgrass. So it's not 100% effective. But in aggregate, looking across all the pastures, yes, there was like lower annual grass overall in the crested wheatgrass than the non-crested sites. But yeah, one thing that I need to think through more as I get into that analysis is, what determined that crested wheatgrass was planted there in the first place. Like if that's something that we're dividing the data by, we do have to consider the decisions that have gone into which places have which treatment in the first place.
Good question.
Oh, and there's another question about, given the large scale burns over BC in the last few years, what would you be interested in looking at for future research? You talked about burn severity, perhaps hydrophobic soils. Yeah, I think contrast of burn severity could be really interesting, and especially those effects on soils. If you have a severe enough fire that it's changing the hydrology that much, then it could have sort of non-linear effects on the vegetation afterwards. So yeah, nothing specific in mind, and I don't know that much about the burns in BC, but that's a great question. Cool. Well, I will put my email in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch after this.
That's great. Thanks for that. Last call for questions, and then in respect of everyone's time, I guess we'll just plug the next call next week. Amanda Miller talking about 3 years of targeted grazing to reduce wildfire risk. Same time, same place.
All right. Thank you.